My name is Oliver Schmidtgen. I have the pleasure of leading you through this evening. I'm directing the Center for Global Studies here at the University of Victoria. Let me, before we start off, acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking people territory whose relationship with this territory and the traditions continue, and in particular the Squamish, Squamish, and Songhees people who have lived in this land far longer than us, the settlers of this land. This is an invitation, and I would like to warmly welcome you, an invitation to the Gordon Smith Lecture Series that we established when Gordon Smith left the Center in recognition of his outstanding work that he did over the course of 15 years, starting in 1997 to 2012. And we are very fortunate to have Gordon with us tonight. Welcome back to Victoria, Gordon. He was kind enough to come from Ottawa all the way to join us for this evening. And before I ask Gordon to come and say a couple of words and introduce our speaker for the night, let me just give you, most of you might know Gordon from his years here, but let me just give you a sense of the enormous legacy that Gordon has left here at the Center for Global Studies in the University of Victoria. As I said, Gordon joined the University of Victoria in 1997 after a long, very distinguished career in the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs. And while Gordon was here at UVic, he received the Biennial medal from the Institute of Public Administration of Canada for his long-standing and lifelong commitment to an expertise in public administration. And this expertise he brought to full fruition coming to the center, and he spearheaded a couple of initiatives that still shape public policy to this day. Just to give you a sense, he was instrumental in calling for the extension of the G8 meetings. He put forward a series of proposals for lasting peace in Afghanistan, and probably the highlight of the extraordinary achievements that Gordon had here at the center is that he was instrumental in pushing for the creation of the G20 Leaders Summit and meetings, which are still ongoing. So that is an enormous legacy and work in the public arena that gives you a sense of how committed Gordon has been to offer his expertise, his experience, in his research and outreach in the field of public policy making. So, Gordon, we are very delighted to have you back here, and if I could ask you to come up here and to introduce our guest speaker.
It's a great pleasure to be here tonight back on the University of Victoria campus. I'm living in Eastern Canada now with our family, and we think the leaves look pretty good there, but they're not bad out here either. As I say, it's a pleasure to be back here. It was an honor to have been asked originally to develop the Center for Global Studies, and it sounds like a long time, 13 years, but in fact the time went very quickly. And I think we did achieve, I think Oliver gives too much importance to what I did as an individual. We had a team and we did a lot of things together, but it was a fascinating time to be here, because we were really looking at global problems in terms of what kind of global governance can be developed to deal with some of the big global issues like climate change, and I could go on. When I think of where we are today, and when I look ahead as to where we're going, and that is why I approached Graham Fuller to talk to us tonight. It seemed to me that we're going into a substantial amount of change. That are we going back to a period that occurred a long time ago, or is this now going to be different? Graham and I were talking before I started to talk here, before we were waiting to get the sound system up, about when we met. We think we met about when we were both working on aspects of the Afghan problem, of Afghanistan. We actually collaborated in one report, as Oliver mentioned. And discouragingly, when we look at the report again, we find that the recommendations we made were about spot on, but nobody wants to hear about that 5 years after the event. But things have really changed. So that's when I got to know Oliver, not Oliver, but when I got to know Graham. His background is really quite extraordinary, and I only touch on aspects of it. He was in Kabul. He was the last CIA person to leave the Afghan regime, and worked also, I believe, in Pakistan. So he was a field officer of CIA. But then he went in to the National Intelligence Council, which, as many of you know, is the body in the United States government that produces estimates as to how the world is likely to evolve. Very well worth watching it, or at least reading if you've never done so. So he went into the National Intelligence Council. He spent time in the RAND Corporation, which is probably most of you know as a think tank, and now has retired. He left the United States to move up to Squamish. We've all been to Squamish. Many of us have only gone through Squamish at high speed on our way to Whistler. But there's a lot that goes on in Squamish, and Graham never stops. Graham has produced an extraordinary series of publications, some that are non-fiction, but he's also written fiction. And he's extraordinarily prolific. He makes me feel rather lazy, as a matter of fact, when I see all that he has managed to accomplish. So I could go on at some length. I encourage those of you who are interested in following Graham a little bit more, grahamefuller.com. There he does a blog, and you'll see there his publications. But I don't want to hear more of myself, and I'm sure you don't as well. But I would really like to hear what Graham has to say as he looks with us this evening down the track a little ways from where we are now, and gets the beyond Trump period. Is Trump there forever? I hope not. But it's more than just Trump. I think a lot of us think Trump. My wife tells me I do too much watching of Trump on television. She's right. But we're into a period, I think, where we really want to think about where the world is going, how it's going to be shaped. So I give the floor to you, Graham. I ask you all to vote.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm wired up here with two different systems, so hopefully you will be able to hear me and I will not be electrocuted in the process. And just some water here, which will make it more dangerous. So I'm delighted to be here. Gordon has asked me off and on over the years in the past to come to UVic. And each time I come to Victoria, I must say I like it more and more. I come from a more rugged terrain of near Vancouver and Squamish, which I also love. But it's a delight to be here and to meet a lot of professional people. Frankly, I don't meet many people who are roughly in the same professional business as I am anymore. I don't mind that because I've done it so much of my life, but it's a pleasure to talk to people like yourselves. Gordon has asked me to be blunt. He didn't use these words, but basically suggested I should throw down some good red meat in front of the audience. I basically feel that I will not have served my purpose if I don't provoke some of you into some fairly sharp reaction. So what I'm going to really give you tonight is my take, as I've gotten long in tooth, but my take on where things are in the world and what I think is wrong with them and a few of the things that I think are right. They may be rather harsh in some of their interpretations, maybe not. But I look forward to, I know that many of you will speak up who I hope will disagree and tell me where you think I've gone wrong. I will benefit from that myself. Okay, so as I say, broad brush, fairly opinionated. Opinionated is a good word. It means somebody having a lot of opinions. on things as opposed to giving facts. I'm not going to give very many facts. The facts are mostly out there, but that's enough said on that. There are approximately 6 major themes that I'd like to touch on tonight. First of all, as we move into a world of major shift in many respects, I want to talk about the absolute decline of the United States. Also relative decline, but absolute decline of the United States in a number of respects. The rise of others, which is well known to all of us, which is causing the nature of international relations to change quite dramatically as we speak almost daily. I'd like to talk a little bit about new technology and its impact on authoritarianism, because I think there is a lot of authoritarianism coming in all of our futures, and technology is one of the main drivers of that. I'd like to talk a little bit about what is the most likely model of governance for the future. When I talk about model, I'm not saying, yes, this is the ideal model, the way the rest of the world should be. By model, I just mean a type of governance which is quite likely to prevail or become very powerful and important. And it's interesting to look across the world and see what countries are maybe doing things that are likely to survive and go on in this particular respect and what are not. I'd like to talk about where the place of Canada is in all of this. And as most of you know, I'm a newcomer. We emigrated to Canada some 17 years ago. I'm a proud Canadian citizen and Canadian passport holder. So when I go abroad and flash my passport, it's the real thing, unlike many Americans who I gather who are hiding behind maple leaves on the back of their backpacks. And finally, I have yet to meet one, but I look forward to it because I'd like to interrogate them closely about exactly where they're from in Canada, what party did they vote for. It'd be fun to unmask one of my former national, what do you call them, compatriots. And finally, talk a little bit about global warming, global crisis, climate crisis. I think crisis is not too strong a word to use, because for all the other things that I may talk about, global warming crisis may be what in the end trumps, and no pun intended, trumps everything else that is on our usual geopolitical agenda here. Okay, one of the earlier versions of the title of the talk was a post-US era. What do I mean by post-US? Well, I think we all know that the US has been roughly the leader of the world for 75 years in one respect or another. I also would argue that it is now fatally wounded. I'm willing to compromise and argue about the adverb fatally, but I probably will stick with it, fatally wounded as a global leader. And I don't, as I look with the best of faith, I don't see very many ways out from this. But perhaps some of you will have a less jaundiced view than I do as somebody who felt I could not comfortably live in the United States anymore, starting with 9/11 and George W. Bush. Gordon hinted at this briefly, but I think for the United States right now, the most dangerous fantasy that both parties live under is that Trump is the main cause of all this mess. And if we could only get rid of Trump, then we could breathe a sigh of relief and things could go back to normal. I completely reject that argument. I would argue that Trump is the logical culmination in many respects of where the U.S. is headed. I dislike the man intensely. He's a braggart, he's a blowhard, he's a bully, he's ignorant, he shoots from the hip, all kinds of things. But there's more to him than simply just that. But I wish he was the main problem, because then that problem will be solved in 18 months from now in the next election, or God forbid, at the end of another term. But that's to be seen. Because I think to believe that Trump is the problem is really to let people off the hook. It means that the real hard work that the United States needs to do to try to restore some vestige of leadership in the world will be ignored. People will be unwilling to do that hard, heavy lifting that I think is required. So Trump, in that sense, is a bigger problem than we think. Also, if we look at the U.S. as a leader of the world for the last 75 years, more or less, it came under rather unusual circumstances that this took place. We all know that there was a World War II. The United States, I think, likes to think that the cavalry came riding in, and the United States saved Europe in both wars from defeat. Certainly the U.S. contribution was significant, but I think to overlook, say, the Russian contribution, who lost 25 million people in the course of the last war, would be a great disservice. But anyway, I don't want to argue. We don't need to argue. There's nothing to argue about. After the Cold War, the world was prostrate from utter destruction of Europe and much of the rest of the world. So the U.S. maintained a leadership. It had not been touched by war directly in any significant way. And then came the Cold War, which was very serious. I think as I look back on it now, maybe I think this Cold War was a little less serious than we like to think it was, but it was nonetheless serious. And the United States obviously was the leader of the phrase was leader of the free world, or leader of the West, or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, these are unique circumstances. World War II, utter destruction of Europe, then a Cold War. Looking back now on that period, I see two devastating blows to the United States, neither of which I think were fully realized at the time, certainly not the first one. The cruelest event of all, perhaps for the United States, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because at that point, the United States became convinced that it was supremely victorious, and it was, in many ways. The Soviet Union was not a terribly viable system. Looking back, that's fairly clear. But at that point, we all know the terms that were used of the United States being the indispensable nation, the world's sole superpower. We all heard those terms for year after year about the world's sole superpower, and there was a strong element of truth to it when the Soviet Union collapsed. But if the United States believed its own rhetoric in this case, so that once the Cold War was over, and it was very interesting, I think it was Shevardnadze, who was then the Soviet foreign minister, just at the last days, or maybe it was Gorbachev, and he said to, I don't know who it was, maybe to the American Secretary of State or somebody, he said, "We are going to do a terrible thing to you. We are going to take away your enemy." And that was the case. The Soviet Union disappeared, no real viable enemy returned, and the United States believed then that this was now going to be the American century. I mean, it's hard to believe that 20 years ago people were talking about the 21st century as the American century. The second really cruel event is a little more obvious, but that was 9/11. I don't think Osama bin Laden could have remotely conceived of the impact that 9/11 would have on the future of the United States. Yes, it was a very ugly event. A lot of people died, but then in wars around the world, a lot of people die in general. I think the United States has took this aboard as a unique cross of suffering for it, and enabling them, empowering them to do anything and everything in the world as the world's sole superpower to change things, and hence we began to get the global war on terror. So I don't think, and the huge buildup of these intelligence organizations, security organizations, paranoia about further attacks of terrorists around the world. And there are terrorists, and there were terrorists, there are terrorists, but I think it became a full-blown paranoia by one of the states of the world which was more powerful to withstand this type of thing than almost any other state in the world. So in the event, the U.S. was the world's sole superpower, perhaps for 10 years, if that. So I'd like to quickly check off now what I think some of the major flaws of U.S. governance and society are. These are familiar to almost all of you. The question I want to raise here, though, is in part not just the flaws that many of us recognize, but why? Are these the flaws typical of only the United States? It could only happen in the United States? Or are these flaws that maybe slip over a little bit into democratic practice, as in the United States? Are they flaws that might creep over the border into Canada or not? Some of them may, some of them may not. But I think as we look at the faults and flaws of the United States at this point, I would argue, as I say, near fatal flaws. We need to think about what is wrong. So I'm just going to tick these off. I'm not going to give you statistics. They're all available, and it would take too much time. This country, the United States, has the biggest gap between rich and poor of any major Western or industrialized country in the world. I have a terrible head for statistics, but I mean, the gap between the top CEOs and the lowest people within their factory is huge. The biggest in the Western world. Class lines are sharper than ever before. Americans are uncomfortable with the word class because it suggests Marxism, it suggests communism, but the class lines are drawn more sharply. As you know, the middle class is suffering more than ever before. But what constitutes a class now, a lower class, a middle class, an upper middle class, is not clear, but it's not the same thing as it used to be. Social mobility. This was the great pride in the United States. You know, come to the United States, anybody can be a millionaire, everybody can make it. I think there was a great deal of truth to that for a long period of time, but it is not very true today statistically. The number of people who break out of one class or a particular social position to get rich and become millionaires, in other words, enjoy social mobility, is much, much less than it has ever been, according to statisticians. Guns are out of control. I don't even need to elaborate on that. Right? We all know this. Every single day there are more incidents. How a country can continue to operate in this space is unbelievable. I don't know that anybody is going to be able to take these guns away at this point. The country is so awash with them, and it is so ideologically now part of the American right to have these guns. And every time there's a terrible thing, some shooting in schools, people say, you know, if the teachers were armed, that wouldn't have happened, or if the people in Starbucks were armed, then, you know, this wouldn't have, that, you know, I don't even need to dwell on this particular. Politics is very polarized. You know this, everybody knows this. The deadlock in Congress, and nobody is trying to work out good legislation anymore. The whole point of politics in the United States is to ensure that Obama cannot do anything, and when Obama leaves, to ensure that Trump cannot do anything. This, I don't know how you get out of that problem. The Democratic Party has this fantasy that, and as I said earlier, that it is all Trump, and that we wouldn't be in this situation. And Hillary Clinton deeply believes to this day that if it wasn't for Trump, if it wasn't for Russia, that she would be president today. I don't buy that, but the Democrats tend to believe that. The U.S. is now one of the most corrupted countries in the Western world. By corrupt, I mean the amount of money that washes through the political system is unbelievable. We're not talking petty corruption. I don't even know if there's much petty corruption in the state. You know, you go down to get your driver's license and you slip $20 for your examiner and he gives you a driver's license, everybody, you know, smiles. It's not that type of thing. We're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing into virtually every politician in the House and Senate. Mark Twain, who 150 years ago got a lot of things right, among other things, said, "The U.S. has the finest Congress that money can buy." It's staggering because it's part of the news cycle is who's got more money, which candidate is ahead, who's collected more, what big donors have given, and what. I mean, this is an open sort of horse race celebrating who got the most number of essentially bribes. I'm going to use this ugly word, but I think it's an important word to use. Because anybody who thinks that when you get a contribution from a major corporation for $100,000, that the corporation doesn't get anything from this, I'm not saying they can call all the shots, but that corporation will be, the door is open to that corporation, their arguments will be heard, and they will have some influence. So it's massive corruption in that sense. I hate to say it, but the legacy of slavery, I thought with the election of Obama that we had really crossed a divide. It was thrilling. But I don't think we've crossed a divide, and the black intellectuals who are now writing on these subjects are a bit more bitter than ever before in terms of the divisiveness of the system, that never, in their view, will blacks get out of where they are. They can financially, very possibly, educationally, very possibly. Legally, they do pretty well, but in terms of really getting into the system, it's it's fairly ugly situation. The American empire, I don't need to get into this, has been devastating to the United States. The cost of maintaining an empire, I think some 87 military bases around the world, just in case. The states that have military bases in their own home states and don't want to give them up because they're employers, it's very, very hard to give all that stuff up. And the costs of empire and the military budget that goes with it removes everything else from the possible agenda of what needs fixing in the United States. Not the least of it is that with a budget, a military budget that is the size of the next 7 countries together, the military budget of the next 7 countries together, the U.S. budget is equal to those, and that includes Russia and China and UK and Israel and several other countries. So we're not talking small countries, we're talking really big countries. We can't afford, in the United States, we cannot afford health care, universal health care, but don't touch the military budget. There's a lot of enemies out there. So this kind of thinking produces a national paranoia, which of people writing these estimates, and I've helped write them myself in my day. I was pretty good at it. I wasn't writing crazy stuff, but just, analyzing things that could potentially go really wrong. And this enemy and that enemy. So the country is kept in a sort of semi-state of permanent paranoia about all these enemies and what could happen. And you just look at the publications coming out of all these so-called think tanks in the United States. It's the coming crisis with China, or the looming confrontation with India, or whatever it is. I mean, there are all these bold words, but there's always a crisis somewhere in the world, and every place matters to the United States. I fear the United States now is in denial of most of these realities, but the elites bemoan now as they see slowly this loss of leadership. There's a fear of bemoaning of the end of this leadership, the string of losing wars. The United States is now in some 7 wars around, mostly in the Middle East area. And at that point, the argument which is mainly raised by those who favor this is U.S. credibility is on the line. So we can't pull out. No matter how stupid it was, we should never have been there. We're losing the situation, but U.S. credibility is on the line. That's a very dangerous drug. So I fear the United States is somewhat living in an unreal world, a fantasy world, as it looks around at what is going on in the world. If you look at U.S. media, it's an absolute disaster. Fox News we all know about. I mean, this is just a propaganda mouthpiece for most of the Republican Party. But the New York Times, I grew up thinking the New York Times, if it was in the New York Times, it was true, and if it wasn't in the New York Times, it wasn't true or it didn't happen. I mean, that was a bit naive, perhaps, but that's the way I think most people thought about the New York Times. Today, the New York Times is very, very unreliable press. It's a wonderful magazine, wonderful coverage on culture, music, arts, social trends, blah, 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 but it is 24/7 drumbeat against Trump, nonstop. So once you've read one article or the headlines of one article, you've read it for a week. You know what they're getting at. Their writing about Russia is unbelievable. I have said this now for several years, and I have not had to pay up yet. I have offered friends or people in audiences $100 for any time they will show me a New York Times article on the last 3, 4, 5 years that is neutral about Russia. There are almost none. There was one that was almost made the line. I was afraid I was going to get called on it by some of my friends, but I wasn't. But the drumbeat against Russia is nonstop. I'll talk more about that later. The United States also talks about CNN as being the left, the mouthpiece of the left in the United States. This is a joke, incredible joke for any of you. I'm sure you all watch CNN again. I don't watch these things myself. And I accuse my Canadian friends who sit mesmerized in front of the screen watching all this drama going on in U.S. politics. I accuse them of watching political porn. But it's dismaying that you cannot really get a very accurate, the coverage on China is fairly biased, not as bad as Russia, but China, on the Middle East, on Israel, very biased for the most part. Noam Chomsky, I don't know where he stands in the Canadian pantheon of political commentators. I don't think there's an American alive that's even heard of Noam Chomsky. No, he will be never mentioned in the New York Times, the Washington Post, on any TV program whatsoever. He never appears. I'm not advocating Noam Chomsky absolutely, but he is a non-person with his, I think, fairly biting critique of what's wrong with U.S. society. Okay, I better move on along here because I just want to say one more thing about the Russian case because I think this is important. I wanted to say at the outset, I didn't, that, but as Gordon mentioned in the introduction, and if he hadn't, I would have said, I was an operations officer in CIA for 20 years. I was in many, many different countries, Middle East and Asia. I say this now, not to blow my own horn, but because my own position is now generally out of touch with what passes for mainstream views in the United States and is viewed as, a little left-wing, a little bit out there. I insist, I scream about my CIA credentials, at least not because that means I'm right, but because at least it means I've been out in the real world a little bit, and that I'm not just some total, love hippie about the state of the world. I'm not claiming anything except my views are not, should not be viewed as lovey-dovey kind of stuff. I think you all know too about militarization of U.S. foreign policy. There's not much more diplomacy left in the United States. The State Department's been taken apart. It's been that way for years. It's been staffed by less and less competent people before Trump and after Trump. Military basically is running most of U.S. foreign policy. And the military, by the way, is often rather intelligent about the way it views things and wants to avoid, in many cases, rushing into war, say with Iran, because they know what that could entail. It's the so-called civilian chicken hawks, of which Trump is not one. This is one of the many curious aspects of Trump. He doesn't like these things. It is not the military simply beating the drumbeat of war. So I think all of these things put together, it's hard to see this as a country which is going to present itself as a major leader of the rest of the world before Trump. Then I think we all know it's not just the decline of the US, but the rise of almost everybody else. I mean, China, Russia back on the scene after being 20 years off the scene with the collapse of the Soviet Union. India, Turkey, a very important player now. Brazil, I think the UK has gored itself to death now, probably fatally also. I have some hope for the EU for a major constructive role, but it's a force in the world. I fear that the EU has been poisoned, however, by US policies towards Russia in the past, because NATO has essentially been the US instrument of foreign policy in Europe. So to get everybody on the Atlanticist wagon, which was a sort of shorthand for the US perspective on things. I trust the Europeans more than I do Washington to deal with Russia. They're closer to Russia, they know the realities better, and they don't have this ideological obsession. I use that word very deliberately, I would say today, an American obsession with Russia. The Republicans have the obsession because it bolsters budgets. There's this enemy out there, it's going to be there forever. They're doing all these terrible things around the world. And with the Democrats, they all know that it was Russia that caused Hillary Clinton to lose the election. As I say, I deny that. Many people do point out that there were many, many other factors, not least of which was Hillary Clinton herself. So I think that kind of obsessiveness is not helpful. All right, let me go on. But I raise these issues because I want you to think about how many of these problems are potentially of danger to Canada itself. Money in politics, it could be. It's nothing like the United States, but something to worry about. Control of the press to the point where there is no left wing in the United States at all, by any mention, any reasonable term. Nothing in the media, no movements, nothing. Is Canada essentially also the victim of too few hands controlling most of the press, and from essentially a right-wing perspective? I can't answer that question. I leave it to you. But if these problems are besetting the United States, how many of them might be starting to affect Canada? Okay, I find it ironic when we look, I'm now switching gears here a little bit to talk about new elements of international relations. And clearly, the fact that the U.S. is not dealing with diplomacy very much and not very interested in diplomacy and interested in military solutions, military approaches. The two major nations now, well, three if we count the EU as a whole, and I do, and China and Russia, that are fairly serious players on this. I fear, I hate to say it, but I fear that both China and Russia, especially Russia, have been vastly more skilled in diplomacy than the United States has. Putin is a very smart guy and a very shrewd diplomat and a very knowledgeable person. I might be strung up for saying that in mainstream media in the United States, but I think if you think about Lavrov, his foreign minister, is also a very, very shrewd guy. So Russia, especially in the Middle East, has been essentially running rings about the United States, which seems not able to cope diplomatically with these Russian moves, which are mostly not military, they're mostly diplomatic in nature. And again, I come back to my CAA background. I majored in Russian at university. I lived with a Russian family in Boston before I went out to the bigger world. I ran around with KGB officers in many, many different countries and had to deal with KGB issues for many, many years. So I am not just naive on this point, but I think now the balance has tipped very strongly in the direction of much more creative and skillful foreign policy by Russia and by China than the U.S. The U.S. is still trying to put together alliances which are mostly anti-Chinese at this point, trying to build these alliances. What are the Chinese doing? They're out there making loans in Africa. They're building, it's quite imaginative. We'll see how it comes out. But this one belt, one road, a huge railways and interstate highways will be running all the way across Central Asia. Even Italy has bought into being the terminus of one of these things. It's already in play. These are quite creative ideas when you think about what a backwater Central Asia has been for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the U.S. is stuck now on this business of saying, we've got to get together to stop China, we've got to get together to stop Russia. It's not even a particularly constructive policy, whatever the virtue of that argument might be. Again, the irony of Donald Trump. I dislike Trump very much, and I can name the ways, but you know the ways. But I support the fact that he's been willing to talk to Kim Jong-un in North Korea. It may be naive, nothing may come of this, we don't know yet, but it was better that he was willing to go and meet this guy on several occasions, so that they at least know each other a little better, and we'll see what comes of this. Maybe nothing, maybe something, but it was better than these wild threats about bombing people into obliteration that had been the norm of discussion, rockets sailing over Japan and all that kind of thing. I don't want to say it's been successful, but I applaud the effort. I applaud the idea that Trump is willing to talk to Vladimir Putin. I think people should be meeting with Putin, once a month. The Chinese meet with Putin once a month. Why shouldn't the United States, which has a lot of concerns? But no, they don't want to do that. Trump has even offered to talk to Iran, maybe a non-starter, but it's interesting that he's willing to say that, and people in the State Department tear their hair and say, no, we can't do that, we can't talk to them because we got this list, and all these things have to take place before then. So I applaud the idea that Trump is at least trying to break open some of these old logjams that have existed for a long time. Let me make one provocative remark. I think Donald Trump two things. There's a term in Marxism-Leninism that was called somebody or something being objectively progressive. What does objectively progressive mean? It means that no matter how backwards, how primitive, how reactionary, no matter what you're doing in your country, if what you do is serving the longer range interests of the spread of socialism, then objectively speaking, in the flow of history, you are aiding that. So even though you don't know it, you are objectively progressive. It's an interesting Marxist concept. I don't know how truly valuable, but I raise the question, is Trump objectively progressive? It's something to think about. His stuff, I won't go into all the terrible adjectives you know about, all the minorities, women, style, all of this stuff. But he has also galvanized women and the women's movement. He has galvanized, women are marching, workers are marching, people of color are marching. Lots more public participation. For the first time now, the US is beginning to open up just a little bit onto the left, where there was never any left at all. It's a joke to think of any left in the United States. The Democratic Party, by normal European terms, is just right of center. Now, a little bit of open space is opened up because of Trump, because of people being galvanized by this man that they dislike so much. So I think this in itself is useful. Secondly, and this is even more controversial, but I think I welcome a new post-US world myself. I welcome a multipolar world. You can come back at me very skillfully if you say, unipolar world, America, the global policeman, worked. It's the best formula that we know. It's worked it throughout history. I can't answer that. I cannot respond to that. I cannot overcome your argument if you're going to come at me with that argument. But my own argument is, I welcome a multipolar world. I think the more people that are engaged in these decisions around the world, the better. I think we believe this about everything else. We don't want any one corporation or any one political party or one leader having all the say. And similarly around the world, I would like to see a multipolar world. Trump is hastening that day. He's hastening that day because he has pissed off a lot of leaders that were sort of used to the old way of doing things. NATO in particular. I happen to believe, and I'm sure a lot of you will disagree with me on this, I happen to believe that NATO long outlived its use once the Cold War came to an end. It did a great job during the Cold War. I think it fulfilled its purpose. It should have been allowed to die peacefully. Many Europeans think so. Some Europeans do not think so. But Trump, through insults and failing to go to meetings and one thing or another, is gradually pushing the Europeans into a more independent position. You know, when Merkel gets enough insults from Trump, the Europeans are beginning to say, you know, maybe we should just think about our own defense policy. Maybe we should have our own military. Maybe we should think about how to deal with these problems ourselves instead of buying into the US package of how to treat Russia and how to treat China. I think that's progressive, but there is a case to be made that it's a step backwards. Most people in the US would say it's a step backwards. What will change any of this in the US? I think the US is going to have to basically hit the wall, and I will not define that further, but I think something pretty awful is going to have to take place. Is that Trump? Or a second term of Trump, I don't know. But to shake up the bubble fantasy that most Americans and American politics are living with now is essential. My biggest hope is the younger generation will be able to perceive this and move forward. Okay, let me talk briefly about a model. We are supposed to end at 7:30?
The whole event, but
We
how much
got
more time do
delayed.
we need? 5 minutes, would this be okay?
Yeah, 5 to 10. Okay, sorry. What country represents a model for the future of governance? By model, I don't mean saying, yes, this is the model we want for the world. I'm saying, what system of government is likely to prevail over the coming century as most common? I reluctantly suggest that it may be China. It may be China. I don't think the U.S. now is qualified. I think the U.S. has disqualified itself. And I don't see how it's going to get out from under this. Disqualified itself as a leader for the rest of the world as to how to run itself. I'd love to think, if we look around the world, through Scandinavia, wonderful places, wonderful people, wonderful social and political order, but it's very small and pretty homogeneous, despite some immigration. Other countries like Germany could be a candidate, or the EU in some respects. Germany simply because it's biggest and most powerful. France by itself, I don't see that. Certainly not India. Possibly Canada. And I will come to that towards the very end of my remarks. But where else is there a country which is essentially claiming that they have a perspective on the future of the world? When you look at Chinese accomplishments, they're quite extraordinary. They brought 800 million people out of poverty into middle-class life. They are now competing with the United States and the rest of the world in technological leadership, in production of electric cars, in production of solar panels, all kinds of things. They are skilled in the management of a 1 billion plus people, which is no mean task for a country to have to manage that many people. That takes quite, you're walking the razor's edge here between allowing things to go to hell as opposed to keeping a fairly firm grip. I don't want to say that that's the model that I want, but it's important to think that China may, and it can claim stability. Most countries of the world might crave stability. We would crave stability if we lived in countries of endless civil war and murder and struggles of ethnic struggles of one sort or another. And the question of capitalism. I think it's important. Scandinavians, I think, get this, and some others do as well. In the United States, capitalism is a moral value. It is seen not only valuable in a useful sense, but a moral value. I would suggest that it is not a moral value. It is a mechanism. It's a tool. It's like fire. Nobody is going to say, "Oh, we love fire. Let's have more of it everywhere. Fire, fire, fire." Of course, nobody's going to say that fire lights are, can warm our houses and heat our homes and cook our food and provide light, blah, blah, blah. But nobody thinks that just fire running wild. It's a tool, it's an instrument. Similarly with nuclear power. You don't say, "Oh, let it just run wild." Of course you don't, it's got to be tightly controlled. Capitalism is a amoral, no moral value whatsoever. A very efficient tool, used properly and carefully, can be very productive. Karl Marx knew this better than anybody in his writings. So I think the idea that the United States or other countries that put so much weight on maintaining capitalism and free markets, that's not the question. The question is maintaining the best life for the most number of people. If that's by capitalism, or controlled capitalism, or semi-socialism, or all socialism, I don't know, but that's the second stage of the argument. The first stage of the argument is the best life for the most number of people, and then we argue about how you get there. But let's not think that capitalism is somehow this great value. All right, let me move on. Time is really running short. Canada as a model. I would love to say yes. It's a somewhat sizable country. It's flourishing in so many respects. I think it has some of the best governance anywhere in the world. I don't know whether Canada has the fire in the belly to undertake that mission. I fear that the United States has been living in the shadow. Canada has been living in the shadow of the United States for a very long time, and I find most of my friends having an exaggerated sense of, "Oh my God, if we did that, then the United States could do X, Y, or Z back to us." It's very possible, and I may be naive, and I've only lived here 17 years, so I don't know everything that the U.S. has done to Canada, but I would love to see Canada develop a much more independent international view, something more like Germany. But you are better judges of what is possible and not probable. But I think tying Canada's wagon, tying Canada's star to a failing U.S. agenda is not a useful model for Canada. I've got a number of other things I would say, it'll probably come up in discussion, but one last thing. The surveillance state, just 2 minutes on this. I think technology now is allowing all states to become surveillance states. You know which country in the world had the most advanced and most widespread use of cameras on the streets? It was the United Kingdom, exactly. Canada is now, not Canada, China has now surpassed the UK in that regard. So it's not just some totalitarian Eastern thing. I think when everybody can read everybody's emails and surveil anybody, everybody all the time, obviously all governments are going to use this to one extent or another. I don't see how it's escapable for the future. And finally, global warming. I am struck by the fact that we all have read so much about global warming. I, for one, in my life, have not felt almost one iota of anything being done about this. I mean, yes, I carry out my little plastic baggies for recycling. I tend to, when I carry them out, I tend to think of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. But none of us have started paying any price whatsoever for this. If we are serious about global climbing, and you read David Suzuki, and you read Bill McKibben, and others who are serious environmentalists, they all say there's no going back. The best thing we can do is facing what is coming and learning how to manage this as well as we possibly can. But so far there's no inconvenience. Nobody has told you that you have one more year to drive your gas car, and then you're going to have to go electric, and the car will be taken away from you. Nobody has said that you may only drive 15,000 miles or kilometers or whatever a year, or 20 or whatever. Nobody has told you that you can only take 50,000 air miles a year now, so you better use that usefully rather than flying to Thailand for vacations. I mean, there are many, many restrictions that you could imagine that people say we need to begin to show a sense of seriousness. I do not see a single thing yet other than a lot of talk. So it's getting serious, and I think the changes that global warming will wreak in terms of winners, losers, refugees, disease, all of those things, we can talk about that more, but it is already changing geopolitics, and will do so even more. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. I'm sure you succeeded in provoking some of us. We have roughly 15 minutes left for discussion. 3 items of housekeeping. Stephanie and Claire will walk the mics to where you are. When I invite you to pose a question, please keep it relatively short, no major statements, concise questions. And then, as you know, we are filming this event, so if you don't want to be on camera, let us know, and we take you out of the recording. And if you could please quickly identify yourself when you start speaking, it's nice for the conversation. So let's go to the back of it, the two of you, please. Wait for the mic, here we go.
Thank you so much. My name is Jenny Preuss, and I just had a question, maybe a clarification. When you commented on how Trump was galvanizing women and minorities, but it is in spite of, what his, I presume, objectives or intentions are. That's not a goal of his. I was just wondering if you could, he is galvanizing them, but, sadly, sort of for the wrong reasons.
No, I'm sorry, I missed the actual thrust of that question. I mean, what about minorities?
You were saying that Trump was galvanizing women and minorities, but that is sort of in spite of his intentions or objectives, not as part of them. So I don't see how that is sort of progress, or why you shouldn't be getting credit for that.
Well, I'm not giving credit to Trump so much as simply acknowledging that things are happening. I would argue that if Hillary Clinton were president of the United States today, there would be less radical views within the United States. I doubt that we would have these strong Democratic candidates, women of color, and others speaking up. Because people would say, well, you know, it's not quite that bad. Trump has made it clear it is that bad. And I think in the end, there will be some positive results. Is it worth it? I can't say, but it's a big change.
Sylvia Schoch, and thank you very much for your talk. It's very interesting, and I agree with practically everything. Just like you said, like even in the Brexit in Europe and the NATO that you explained, it's the counter push, right, to one direction, this automatic counter push. But what would be your suggestion what the EU should be doing right now under the current situation?
What the EU should be doing?
Yeah, how they should regroup, and what would be
Well, I think the EU needs to be EU and very clearly distinguish itself from NATO, because I think NATO has been a very negative influence after the end of the Cold War, because it has essentially attempted to militarize much of the situation in Eastern Europe and has brought US and other military troops right up to the border of the Soviet Union, which I think has been, not Soviet Union, Russia, which has been pretty provocative and I think unnecessary, and I think brought forth considerable reaction from Russia that did not have to be. This was not the situation at the end of the Cold War, even with Gorbachev. So let the EU be the EU, try to work together. Part of the problem of the EU is that it has latecomers, such as Eastern Europeans, who are understandably very concerned about Russia. But I don't think that concern, I feel sorry for Estonians. I feel sorry for Mexicans. And Costa Ricans. I may even feel sorry for Canadians, or I feel sorry for Vietnamese, or Nepalis. When you live next to a great power, life can be quite uncomfortable. But I don't want to see small countries like Estonia, and I don't want to pick on Estonia because it's quite admirable, including in tech areas in many, many ways. I would not want to see their worldview. Oh my God, somebody's got to protect us all the time, permanently. And the U.S. loves to take that role. Yes, we'll be there with you forever, and we'll keep our troops there forever.
But of course, also the immigration issue in Europe.
Okay, let's move on, but thank you for this, please.
Thank you very much for your talk. We're all students coming from Pearson College, the high school that you've chosen. And we're coming from different countries. I'm Daniel from Colombia, and I'm friends from Morocco, Estonia, and other Colombian, Canadians, even Chinese, the Bahamas. And this is a very simple question. I just want to ask you, what's your advice on how we can save the world? We're just 17 years old, 18 years old. We have some ideas, and we have time and energy. So that's the question.
Very easy questions.
Who is we? Meaning everybody in the world? Young people. Well, I think to disregard all the mistakes that all of their older generation has made. I mean, I do not think old farts, including myself, should have too prominent a place in the future, and they come worse than me, believe me. So I think they need to think very seriously about their future, how they're going to live in a world that is going to be somewhat unpleasant environmentally for the future, how they're going to bring some degree of social justice, which is now the United States has failed quite miserably now, I think, in social justice, and what kind of social system, a mixture probably of socialism and free enterprise or whatever, but what kind of system is going to benefit most people? But do not believe that the free market, I mean, most Americans say, well, we've got to protect the free market. That's not number one goal. Maybe number two or number three, but it's not number one goal. How do you preserve the best life for most people? And then we'll discuss how we'll get there.
Just 1 second, you know, watch. We're going to collect the last 4 questions I have now, and then we're going to come back for the last round with you, Graham, please.
And I'm willing to go on a little longer if people
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
When, am I on? No. When Eisenhower, can you hear me? When Eisenhower left office, he warned against the growing influence of the military industrial complex. Would you say that his warning was not heeded?
Thank you.
Yes.
So I just hold your fire for a second.
Okay, I probably will forget them all.
Okay, so Eisenhower, Walter Kaufman.
All right.
There's an old story that an Englishman who lived in the US for 20 years went back to the UK and he was asked, what's their political system? He said, well, it's a two-party system. The ones called Republicans are conservatives, and the ones called Democrats are the other conservatives. That could have been true, but on your point about Trump catalyzing, maybe right or wrong, the Democratic Party in the US is changing its nature. And the question becomes, how many Americans are going to go along with a change in their nature to become, in fact, a true leftist party, not what Americans have been calling the leftist party.
Thank you. We go back to Pearson. Did you raise your hand as well, or? Yeah. Thank you. The mic? And then we have one more, sorry, then we run out of time, please.
Thank you. Hey, I'm Elise, I'm from Estonia.
I'm glad I said some nice things.
So I'd like to be the first person to challenge you on something just like you asked them. I mean, I'm not here to pray or anything, but so first about the EU. So you mentioned it as a country, and to a big degree, I do agree on the sense of European unity, and we do come forward as this big front. However, I would like to take that a bit further. So in a lot of very liberal spaces, we have this talk about the European Federation, and if you talk about things like having our own army, that certainly calls for a federation. Just legally, within the European Union, we can't have an army without turning it into an actual state. And so, do you think that would actually be good on a global scale? Do you think that's realistic? Personally, I don't see Europe going into a federation anytime soon because of nationalism and the rise of right-wing parties. But I'd love to see your thoughts on this, and would you think that in the long term, say after Trump, this could be an actual solution? And also on NATO, something to note is that NATO didn't want to come to Estonia.
And NATO what?
NATO did not want to come to Estonia. Estonia grabbed them and brought them there. As an Estonian, having grown up back home, we are constantly afraid of Russia because of the belief systems that come with it, and knowing that we could be invaded any second as a small country with a very small both political and army power. And so the initiation of bringing NATO in wasn't from NATO, it was from Estonia. And in fact, I remember how we had to lobby for it through the EU. NATO did not want to come.
Thank you. I think we have to move on, but thank you very much. Right.
Hi, my name is Glenn Evans. My question is, do you think that countries that are under the culture of a liberal democracy and a neoliberal economy are going to make a difference as to how effective they will be in countering culture or taking leadership? And do you think that that will be mitigated for everybody by the rise of the surveillance state?
Thank you very much. Graham, you have a whole range of topics, not too much time left, so you take your pick, please.
Sure. Well, on Eisenhower and the military-industrial complex, it's amazing what he said, considering this was, 50, 60 years ago. And no, I think he was dead right, and nothing has changed. The military-industrial complex is more powerful than ever before, and it's a very difficult problem to change. When everybody has been in the trough, who is going to be the first to walk away from the money trough? That includes politicians and industries, and especially defense industries, who flourish from these kinds of conflicts. I may be distorting the question because I just took a few notes, and from here where I'm standing, it's not, the sound is a little muffled. I think the question was about will there be change in the U.S. Likely to come? Who asked the question? Yeah.
The Democratic Party, is it?
The Democratic Party.
Moving to the left.
Will the Democratic Party change? That's a great question, and I don't know. The Democratic National Committee is moving heaven and earth to try to keep traditional middle ground Democrats in power and in the running. They made sure that Bernie Sanders in the last elections would never succeed, although many polls show that he could have beaten Trump. Whatever you think of Sanders. Right now, they would run Hillary Clinton again if they could, and they're very, very uncomfortable with people like even Elizabeth Warren. But she, from their perspective, is the maybe least bad between she and Bernie. But a lot of Democrats want to go with the old, they say, you know, we want to stay conservative, not upset the electorate. That's the number one question for the United States now. I can't answer it. I ask my friends, is it better to say, develop a bold platform about the way the future of the U.S. must look? Or do we say anybody that can beat Trump and go with the same old politics? I happen to believe, you won't be surprised, that it has to be a bold new agenda by bold speakers. But that is much contested, and especially the Democratic National Committee hates that idea. And well, then there was the Estonian question. And I'm very sympathetic. I mean, I've been briefly to Estonia. My daughter spent some time there and loved it. And I respect the great high-tech accomplishments that Estonia has been underway. But I do come back to the statement, I feel sorry for small countries that live next to big countries. It will never go away. If you're Cuban, if you're Mexican, even Canadian, and that's not quite a valid comparison, but certainly Mexican, or Cuban, or Costa Rican, or something. If you're Nepali, if you're Sri Lankan, if you're Vietnamese, next to these great powers, life is not, you're always going to have to be careful about it. I'm afraid I have to disagree with you on whether NATO wanted or didn't want to come in. There are elements of people in NATO who love to come in, wanted to come in. There may be some who didn't want to, but I think bringing NATO up to the gates of Russia was extremely provocative. And I think there is a good case to be made, I won't set it forth here now, but a good case to be made that the deterioration of relations with Russia some years after the fall of the Soviet Union did not have to be. And the kind of statements that Gorbachev and other people were making were very different nature. They were talking about one single European space, blah, blah, blah. So the U.S. had moved quite aggressively to make sure that those troops are moved right up into the Black Sea, right up into the Sevastopol, these areas of Russian fleet, etc. So I don't think I think it's at least a two-way planning for problems with Russia today. But I sympathize with those small states with big neighbors. Then somebody asked a question about the surveillance state. Yes, and I wasn't sure I got your bottom line, but do it.
I'm wondering if there are any differences in the effectiveness of a nation to counter climate change according to the political and social culture, and if the neoliberal democracy, the neoliberal economy and liberal democracy would hamper that.
Yes.
But if that hampering may be somewhat subdued by the tendency of many states to become surveillance-oriented.
Yeah, that's a great question. I tend in my gut to feel that the liberal states, not the neoliberal, but liberal states in general, are not going to be terribly equipped to handle global warming, because if there's anything I ever saw that maybe calls for a more powerful, centralized leadership. It's probably global warming of people who are going to go out and use the colloquialism, go out and kick ass and make sure that things happen, that people don't, who wants to give up their gas car, who wants to limit themselves to 50,000 air miles, or all of these other particular things, but these are going to have to come, and if it has to come through agreement and elections and all of that, it's never going to happen. It's like the cod off the Newfoundland banks. I mean, people knew that the problem was coming, but they fished it down to the very last fish. And I fear that that's the way it's going to go with global warming. Unless somebody really steps in with a fairly blunt agenda to do this.
Thank you, Graham. Bringing this, just give me 1 second, bringing this evening to an end. I would like to thank Gordon very much for coming, and again, you're welcome back anytime, and this is a little token of appreciation that you don't forget us too fast.
Very kind, thank you very much.
And Graham, thank you for entertaining us, provoking us, and giving us some good advice in international politics. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.